Next, we're going to go to India. Europeans started coming to India for trade and land starting in the 15th century. You may remember Columbus, who came to found America invaded America in 1492. He was looking for India. He was trying to find India. So he was part of this effort by Europeans. The Dutch, the Danes, the French, the Portuguese, and the British were all at that time holding some kind of imperial control over parts of India. And India had a huge population. It has a huge population now. It had a huge population at the time. There would have been roughly 300 million people in India at the time. Right now, we have over 1 billion people live in India. But at the time that they started to come and take over parts of India, it was largely inspired by this huge population. The Europeans saw the size of India as an opportunity to get millions of more customers for their products. It was also a place to get things like spices and other materials that could be used to make goods that then they could sell to the Indians. So it was largely an opportunity to open up a new market. Around the 1750s, the British effectively took over the East India Company, which had been the company that conducted and monitored trade with India, between India and Europe. There was a British one, there was a Dutch one, but the East India Company kind of was the intermediary between the European countries and the Indians themselves. And the Brits effectively took over the East India Company around the 1750s. And they began to wage war in the eastern and southern parts of India with the goal of taking over political control of India as well. So not just working as this kind of business commerce role, but they wanted to take over. They wanted to be able to control the institutions, political and otherwise, that were players in that commerce. So the British, like other colonizing powers, in addition to wanting to kind of take over the systems of control and make money off of people, they also believed themselves to be superior to the people in India. So they saw it as their responsibility to civilize, quote, civilize the population. They called that the white man's burden, which means they actively tried to bring British culture and values to India and get rid of Indian traditions. Now, we, of course, know that to be a deeply racist and, to say the least, problematic way of looking at other cultures. But at the time, it was very much the way the British saw their role in India. They saw the people in India as uncivilized, so they saw it as their burden, their position, their responsibility to civilize them by bringing British culture and values. This period of British Raj, which means British rule, lasted from the 1850s to 1947, quite a long time that the Brits were in direct control of present-day India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, in addition to other areas. Of course, there were some parts of India they weren't in direct control over, but largely in direct control over these areas, no longer working through the East India Company. The local officials, the rulers in India on the ground, now answered to the British Crown. During this time, they built railroads, commercialized agriculture, so took the goods that the Indians were growing and making and that they had been buying for quite a long time. They now really upped the commercial market of all that. They established civil and criminal justice system, which they used definitely as a means of controlling the Indian population. When they set up the laws and they set up the systems by which those laws were enforced, they had just so much control over the day-to-day life of Indian people. They also restructured the educational system, and they structured it off of English ideals, which means the students in these educational systems, they were reading English language texts. They were reading English literature. They were reading British texts. They were learning about British people. So this inundation of British culture and language led to a strong influence of British Golden Age writers, such as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle with the Sherlock Holmes stories and Agatha Christie. Given that there are many, many various languages in India, it actually took a while for Indian authors to gain any large-scale countrywide success. They might write in one language, but if other people in India couldn't read it, then they wouldn't be able to get any kind of national success. But people were being taught English and spoke English, so the British writers were able to be successful across the country in a way that the local writers couldn't be. Their general style of detective fiction in India was often relatively short, serialized pieces that appeared in magazines and newspapers. And remember that serialized means, you might have one story that you would get in a bunch of chapters that would come out over time. So a newspaper might publish chapter 1 one day, and the next week they'd publish chapter 2. The next week they'd publish chapter 3. It's not unlike the idea of like a limited series on Netflix where you get, different, an hour of one kind of chapter of it, and then maybe the next week or later on more things will come out. That's serialized. And these pieces are heavily influenced by British style, even as they take into account an Indian setting. So the story we're reading from Indian kind of golden age era is by this guy, pronounced Sharanendu Bandyopadhyay. Sharanendu Bandyopadhyay is an incredibly prolific and well-known and well-loved Indian writer. He was born and lived in various parts of East India during his life. He was Bengali, which is an ethnic group in a part of India. And he studied and practiced law before he gave it up to start writing. So he first started writing poetry, published that in his 20s, and started to write full-time in his 30s once he had achieved enough success. This guy wasn't just prolific, meaning he wrote a lot. He also wrote in a lot of different styles. He wrote novels, poetry, short stories, plays, screenplays, and also had a huge career as a children's author, writing children's books. Within the novels and short stories, plays, and screenplays, he had dabbled in a few different genres, primarily historical fiction, ghost stories, and detective novels, which is why we are talking about him today. He's known for having some humor and wit in his work, and also using twist or surprise endings, where we end up in a place we couldn't have seen coming. And maybe sometimes going against what we know as being kind of the golden age idea of fair play. Sometimes those endings are going to take such a twist that your readers could have had no way of keeping up. That twist couldn't have been seen coming. He created, his primary character was Bhimkesh Bakshi. His detective stories with Bakshi were his most successful. These stories began in the early 1930s with the publication of a story called Satyanwesi. Forgive me for these pronunciations, I'm doing my best. Satyanwesi, which means the Inquisitor. And he actually thought of Bakshi as the Inquisitor, or that can also translate as the truth seeker. That term became known, Bakshi became known kind of interchangeable with that term. Bakshi is a somewhat unique detective character because over the course of 32 stories and novels, Bakshi really progresses as a character. He ages, he gets married, he has a child, he moves to a new location, a new town. Those are things we don't see a lot of in other Golden Age stories. Hercule Poirot, for instance, stays basically the same age in basically the same state of his career over the course of all the books and stories that involve him. He does ultimately die. Agatha Christie did actually kill him off, but we don't see him kind of progressing much in his life situation over time. But Bakshi did. He changed a lot and grew and aged and died. The story we're reading, The Venom of the Tarantula, which is, I should know how to pronounce, The Venom of Tarantula, was published in 1933. So he's more firmly in the time of the Golden Age. But again, somewhat limited in the success the story could have because not everyone was reading language, though he was involved in the translation of it a bit more. And so the English language translation was available. So from India, we're going to go to Latin America, in particular, Mexico. Now, we'll start by thinking about Latin American style. It had less of a cultural valuing of individualism than we have seen in Europe and talked about with American writing. They favored more a collective consciousness. This is due to a lot of economic issues and a series of autocratic governments across Latin America, which meant that Latin Americans more often lived closer to one another and maintained a family structure over generations, which means, the grandparents might live with the family or at least live very close to them. The family structure, very important to society, and people tended to stay very close to that structure and even live among them, which created less of a sense of an individual and more of us as a unit, this family or kind of local unit, that collective unit. Meant that we didn't value individualism as much in that type of writing. They believed less in one person being able to solve something on their own. It's also characterized much by a lack of confidence in systems of government, justice, and law enforcement. The idea that an individual investigator working outside the system could investigate a crime and then hand it over to law enforcement or the justice system and trust their findings would be acted upon would have seemed unrealistic to Latin American readers and maybe even a little ridiculous. So when we think about Hercule Poirot solving it in conjunction with the police, but then telling the police what he had learned and the system of law enforcement following that recommendation, that would have not made sense to Latin American readers at the time. You didn't trust that those systems would follow through. So there are really two types of Latin American detective stories. The first are novelas de enigma. Those are kind of more classic Golden Age style. They focus more on puzzles, and they are solved by logic-focused amateur investigators. So when we think about Golden Age stories, this is the Golden Age form in Latin America. Then they also grew into what are called novelas negras. Those are hard-boiled detective novels. Those are less tidy. They are more focused on critiquing the social, economic, and psychological issues in society. Something that lines up more with the hard-boiled detective stories that came in America post-Golden Age. The kind of renegade private investigator who is, depressed and everything's dark and everybody drinks too much and there's problems, everybody's poor, or the kind of urbanization issues that we see in later hard-boiled stories. That's more like the novelas negras. Mexican stories in particular flourished in the negra style. So that kind of hard-boiled style is much more in line with what we think of as being the most important Mexican style detective stories. They have strong nationalist themes, which means they're very focused on the idea of Mexico, the greater consciousness of what it means to be Mexican and what are the issues plaguing Mexico as a country. They are very much focused on the place in which they happen, not as interchangeable as maybe we might have seen some Golden Age stories where their focus is more on the local place, right? The village, but not maybe Britain as a whole. Mexican style would be very much focused on Mexico as a whole. And so their settings are often very colorful, very focused on local traditions, food, styles, fashion, all of that seems to play more of a role. And they tend to come out of a society that's somewhat chaotic, maybe a society that's going through some upheaval and distress. There is, in Mexican style, no priority on restoring order. It's not tidy. They're not trying to make everything wrap up cleanly at the end, because coming from a chaotic society, they didn't put a priority on, nor did they believe as much that they were working towards a tidy ending, something that we were used to seeing in Golden Age. We don't see as much here. So we are reading a Mexican writer this week. We're reading Maria Elvira Bermudez. She was known as the Mexican Agatha Christie. Even though there are some differences in style, she's kind of seen as the big one as far as women detective writers in Mexico. She's the most prolific Mexican writer during her lifetime. Was the world's most widely published and widely known female author of Spanish language detective fiction while she was alive, and she died in 1988. She started writing in the 1940s. She also wrote, prolific but also wide-ranging in the style of things she wrote, fantasy stories, literary criticism. She was even writing a lot of sociological essays that focused on primarily on gender roles. She was a feminist and talking a lot about what happened to women and how women played out in society and in literature. Incidentally, she was one of the first Mexican women in the 20th century to graduate from college and law school. She graduated from law school in 1939, and the first woman in Mexico to serve as a Supreme Court judge. So she was very familiar with the legal side of Mexican society. She also wrote the first female investigator, Maria Elena Moran, as a protagonist, meaning our main character. She had a series of Moran stories, and that was our first female investigator in Spanish language detective stories. She also wrote a series with another detective, and that's who we're reading from this week, with Armando Zoyzaya, I believe, and The Puzzle of the Broken Watch in 1960. That's the piece we're reading. So as you see, 1960, we're decades after what we tend to see as the ending of the Golden Age. But this was, because of a number of factors, still kind of heavily influenced by the Golden Age. And she wrote primarily those novellas de enigma, that classical mystery style, that Golden Age style. So she fit within the Golden Age style, even though she was publishing after we see the Golden Age as traditionally ending. But she did put some innovative twist on that. And so we're going to see that this week in The Puzzle of the Broken Watch. So as you're reading the text this week, I want you to think about the cultures and time periods from whence they came. Where do you see their cultural influences at work? The things we're talking about with their culture. Where do you see those playing out in the story as you read them? Where do you see similarities between the stories, even though they're from three very different cultures and even three different time periods? And where do you see the differences and where do you see the similarities when you look at these stories together? We're going to talk more about all these questions in the rest of the module, but enjoy reading some Golden Age influenced or related stories from across the world.